And now what I want to do is to turn the program over to Chris Graham, our exhibits curator. Chris received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He worked as an associate curator for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, also as a visiting assistant professor at UNC Greensboro. And he did that before coming to Richmond, where he initially served as a guest curator and lead of a 2-year Mellon Foundation grant project to produce our temporary exhibits at the museum, Greenback America and Southern Ambitions. And Chris was hired last year as the curator of exhibits. So Chris will be talking tonight on stressed out supply chains, life in a failing state, and maybe doing a little bit of exhibit research in the process. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Chris.
Hi, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, we are doing a little prototyping on this, and I will explain that when we get to the end of it. So, Kelly, are we good?
We're good.
All right, man. So I want to begin with the question that few or no history talks have ever begun with, and that is, what are you wearing? But not only what are you wearing, but what does that say about you? Even more, what is the backstory on the thing that you were wearing? Where did it come from? What was the process by which it came to you? Does it say something now about the place or the nation or the society that you live in? And I can begin to, I'll explain what I mean. So I'm wearing this snap button shirt, this kind of Western style snap button shirt. And I like these, and they really kind of I feel like say something about me in terms of my interest. I like the twangy Americana music. I like craft beer. And I've had this thing for about 15 years. I found it in a thrift store because I am cheap. And also it's, I don't know if you can really tell, but it's ridiculously long on me. And as my wife would tell you, I've never really been particularly interested in how I look in the clothes I wear. So the length is silly, but it doesn't bother me too much. Also, apparently, I've been wearing snap button shirts for my entire life. So if you'd like, put something in the chat, which I can't really see right now because I'm screen sharing. Put something in the chat if you like about maybe what you're wearing, what that says about you, and how that places you in the world and the world you live in. And that is part of the prototyping that Kelly talked about. Okay, now, what did William Edward Tucker wear, and what was he wearing in 1865? And I'm going to lift this laptop real quick and go on a quick journey. So he was wearing this jacket, and I don't know how the quality of the picture shows up, but get a close look at the material and the sewing. It's gray, or used to be gray, and it's made of jean cloth, which is a cotton and wool mix. It's entirely hand sewn. The sleeves are kind of baggy and not very attractive. There's 4 pieces to the body of it, and 1 piece each for the sleeve and the collar pieces as well. It's lined with cotton sheeting. You might could see that in there. And again, entirely hand stitched. I don't know if you can see the buttonhole stitching, but that's pretty up close. This, get myself rearranged back here again. This is a military jacket produced by the state of North Carolina's quartermaster department. North Carolina was the only state that fully supplied its soldiers with uniforms throughout most of the Civil War. And it's made of jean cloth, again, wool and cotton weave. It has that 4-piece body, made of 4 pieces, sleeves made of 1 piece each. And it's got a very distinctive look. If you see enough of these things, you start noticing them in photographs, and they really stick out as being different from other military coats and jackets produced by Confederate clothing bureaus during the Civil War. We don't know much about Tucker. This card is the typescript version of the handwritten note that his mother left when she donated this jacket upon his death in 1896 to the museum. Tucker was from Washington, D.C. He somehow, we don't know how, ended up in the 17th North Carolina on Roanoke Island in 1862 and was captured there. The only thing we know about his military service after he was released from being a prisoner of war is what's written on this card, is that he apparently went to Charlotte to work in, quote, Confederate government shops. And for reasons I don't need to get into, I think that's an inaccurate statement, that his mother may have misremembered something. But that's okay. But he's a bit of a mystery. And so he acquired this jacket probably when he was in Charlotte. Of course, the difference between him and me is that he didn't have a choice in what he wore, but this jacket still has a backstory. From the acquisition of raw cotton and wool through manufacture, transportation, and government policy, we can see not only the challenges that faced Confederate logistics, but also the way that these challenges forced to the front the Confederacy's inadequate assumptions about its ability to be a nation, its regular mistakes and occasional incompetence, and how it also managed to transform itself and its values when faced with the challenges of supplying its soldiers with uniforms. And so we're talking about supply chains here. And that's the sequence of processes involved in the production and distribution of a commodity. And to explain, I stole this infographic from the internet. And certainly supply chain management and analysis today is a far more complex discipline than what this image suggests. But this gets at the basic points in here: raw materials, materials manufacture, product manufacture, transportation and distribution, use, and so on. There's not much recycling in the Confederate States, but some things have changed. I really wanted to use this one particularly because it was made by, this image was made by Levi Strauss. And if you know a little background on any of this stuff, you might know that Levi Strauss does have one thing in common with this jacket, and that's that Levi Strauss is making denim during this time period, and denim is the all cotton version of the same kind of material as this, which is called jean cloth. And so blue denim jean comes out of Levi Strauss, and that's the blue jeans we're wearing, like the blue jeans I'm wearing right now, is very similar to the jean cloth in these uniform parts. So I was glad to get this image. So as I was trying to think about an angle on all of this, a way to draw a lesson about our own lives today from this story, I started to think of the COVID crisis. And that's because back in April, we started hearing stories about broken supply chains. Of course, the inability of the United States to supply personal protective equipment to healthcare workers was a glaring case, but also saw it in reports about crops being destroyed in fields rather than rotting in warehouses after restaurants canceled orders. And so I looked at what all this meant for the modern apparel supply chain. And of course, that's a global enterprise, and this is kind of a representation of it. Most production takes place in Asia and Southeast Asia. And the COVID impact on modern supply chains is similar to the restaurant story, but just on a global level. Brands cancel orders, stores cancel orders, shippers stop shipping, factories have shuttered, and the COVID crisis has reportedly impacted nearly 300 million people in the cotton industry alone. That just the cotton supply chain alone. Kelly, owe me a minute at the end of this. Brands have reportedly canceled $2 billion, that's billion with a B, in orders in companies in Bangladesh alone. Entire countries economies are dependent on the apparel trade and being part of the apparel supply chain. I read one report that the COVID crisis had forced apparel manufacturers and shippers to draw up contingency plans to move manufacturing centers closer to consumer hubs out of Asia and closer to North America and Europe, with the idea that shorter supply chains would mean more secure supply chains. That may be okay for brands and it may be okay for consumers, but it sounds more expensive, but possibly a life-altering catastrophe for entire regional economies and the people in them who are dependent on being part of these global networks. And just imagining how this might have been different had major nations contained the virus from the beginning. Millions are at risk because the supply chain is vulnerable not only to natural disasters, but also to failures of government. And that's our problem today. A sick supply chain reflects a sick economy and possibly a sick nation. But let's turn back a little bit and look at the problems that the Confederacy faced in 1861. The Confederate States aspired to nationhood and believe that they have all the critical elements of a modern 19th century nation. And of course, thank you, Kelly, for mentioning it, but come see our new temporary exhibit at the museum that's all about this, called Southern Ambitions, or drop in on Adrian Brettle's book talk that Kelly announced as well, is also talking about this. The Confederate States has a constitution, a government, a social and a labor system, a theory on race, and a global economic vision that they felt entitled them to a status as one of the world's major powers. One thing it does lack at the moment of secession is a military and the internal logistics to supply it and keep it in the field. Confederate leaders have to build that from scratch. And the Confederacy aimed to raise, in the first couple months of the war, 100,000 men for service in the Army, and later in the summer, an additional 400,000 men. So by the end of the summer of the first year of war, they need to put 500,000 men in the field, arm and equipment, and equip them. If you can imagine, that's a monumental task. Eventually, about over 750,000 men are going to serve in the Confederate military forces, and you have to keep those people in good clothes. So how does the quartermaster fit into this? The quartermaster department was responsible for providing uniforms for the Army, amongst other things. And that includes sourcing raw material, contracting textile manufacturers, coordinating the movements of materials between them, and providing inspection and transportation, accounting and bookkeeping for a vast system, and paying for every aspect of it. The quartermaster department is responsible for, North Carolina's expectation here is to fully equip its volunteers bound for Virginia in the spring of 1861, and that's about 20,000 men at this point. At which point those volunteers would be turned over to Confederate service, and the Confederate quartermaster department would be responsible for continuing to clothe and equip them. So North Carolina's quartermaster department is set up in May of 1861, and by statute intended to close in August of 1861. Whereupon its work would be done. And Lawrence O'Brien Branch was the first quartermaster for North Carolina. The problem is that the Confederate States Quartermaster Department, headed by Abraham Myers in the summer of 1861, is completely incapable of clothing volunteers as troops flooded into Richmond and other places around the Confederacy. By August of 1861, the Confederate quartermaster had not improved his capacity, and the Confederate Secretary of War asked states to continue supplying clothing to its soldiers in the Army for the foreseeable future, or at least until the quartermaster department could get itself up to speed. Governor Henry Clark of North Carolina agreed, but on these terms, that one, the Confederate Congress would repay North Carolina for its efforts. And two, the Confederate quartermaster purchasing agents would have to stay out of North Carolina so as not to create too much competition for raw materials, cloth, and drive up prices in those ways. So in October 1861, the North Carolina Quartermaster Department under John Devereux restarts its operation for the foreseeable future. And what they don't know is that it's going to last for the remainder of the war. Okay, so this is where the supply chain begins with raw materials. in the North Carolina quartermaster system, it's not the quartermasters, but privately owned textile mills who are responsible for sourcing cotton and wool. So cotton's easy, and it's everywhere in the Southern Confederacy, and I don't even have to talk about it, because wool is the problem. Southern states did not cultivate a domestic wool production for its factories, and its textile factories prior to secession had imported the majority of their wool from England, Spain, and Ohio. So you might see the problem there with a looming blockade and cut trade relations. So the first of many shortages that millers faced was a severe wool famine beginning in the spring of 1861. They overcame that, but let me tell you about some of the lengths and some of the challenges that they had in doing so. In November of 1861, an agent for Charlotte's Rock Island mills had been dispatched to Texas in search of wool, upon hearing that there was great flocks of sheep being cultivated in western Louisiana and Texas. And he returned in spring of 1862 with coming through Vicksburg with 46,000 pounds of fleece in tow. So you know what's going to happen to Vicksburg pretty soon. Once that same agent couldn't get across the Mississippi after the fall of Vicksburg in '63, he pursued a rumor of an untapped source of wool in along the Georgia-Florida state line. And he discovered that, and so he went there and discovered that growers refused to sell for cash, because even in 1863 in the rural parts of the Confederacy, Confederate money was pointless. So he sent back to his fellow mill agents in North Carolina in the quartermaster department a frantic message saying, send as much cotton yarn here as possible. Right now, we can get a lot of wool if you do so. In 1864, another mill agent scoured Virginia's and North Carolina's mountain valleys, seeking wool from small farmers, no doubt to diminishing returns, since all the obvious places had been worn out already. In the state of North Carolina, foresaw the problem of wool shortages, although a year after the first wool famine, and in the fall of 1862 invested in several blockade runners intended to import woolen cloth from England to serve as a reserve for domestic cloth. And that's a whole other story that I just don't have the time to spend with at this point, but it's pretty interesting. The point is that the textile mills, from the very beginning of the war, played a kind of whack-a-mole in the search for a suitable wool supply after, and especially after Vicksburg closed. Large-scale wool supplies became unattainable, and mill agents had to literally scrounge the findings and leavings of small farmers just to keep in production. The Confederate government itself never did a good job at coordinating supply and prices for wool in the way they did for other commodities like iron. And the open market, with all its restraints, could not keep up. So switching back to the present time real quick, I looked into cotton and wool sourcing today. Wool's easy this time. You either get it from Australia or New Zealand. There really is no other source. Cotton has a wider global footprint. So India, China, and the United States and Brazil are the world's largest cotton producers in that order. And the world's largest cotton importers are China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. These are the largest producers of apparel in the world. COVID will have impacted the very beginning of the cotton supply chain today, even though we have a large number of industrial wool cotton suppliers in the United States. Over 90% of cotton farmers are smallholders. And with payment delays from brands and stores and factories back to growers means that some of these poor farmers are vulnerable to the supply chain breaking down. In fact, I read something yesterday from the Better Cotton Institute that suggests that across the board, many of these smallholders in Asia will be considering a switch to a more local and reliable cash crop to grow, putting another kink in our supply chain going forward. So the next step in the supply chain is materials manufacture and garment production. So where in North Carolina are the mills? And I hope you enjoy my handmade map here. Jean cloth manufacturers in North Carolina were dominated by the major firms in Charlotte and Salem, now known as Winston-Salem, and that's in the red circles on the map. These included Rock Island, Mountain Island, Folings and Springs, and in Charlotte, and the Salem Manufacturing Company owned by Henry Fries in Salem. There were half a dozen smaller companies, mostly located in the state's western Piedmont, like the Yadkin Manufacturing Company in near Salisbury. Cotton manufacturers who made sheeting for bags, tents, shirts, drawers, and linings for jackets tended to be concentrated on the Haw River and around Fayetteville. And the Haw River is the one blue circle that's out in the middle of nowhere, right in the middle. So after textile mills made the textiles, they delivered it to the product manufacturers, the garment makers. Sometimes garment makers were subsidiaries of the textile mills, but just as often they were startups created by dry goods merchants, like the firms of Best and Hughes in Salem, or Howard and Beard in Salisbury, or J.S. Phillips in Charlotte. And logistical problems plagued all textile factories and garment producers throughout the course of the war. And some of it was from frequent raw material shortages and poor coordination that the state quartermaster was supposed to provide. And for instance, jacket maker J.S. Phillips sat idle in August 1863, just as the Army of Northern Virginia was returning from Gettysburg, telling the quartermaster that he had 2,500 jackets ready to be made, but had not received any cotton sheeting for the lining, and so he couldn't make or send any along. Howard and Beard in Salisbury had to stop production in January 1864 because they no longer had cotton thread on hand. Because of the blockade and disrupted trade with the northern United States, millers could no longer acquire whale oil to lubricate their machines. Their machines quickly wore out, and they experimented with peanut oil as a replacement, because North Carolina's got some peanuts for sure. Their machines quickly wore out, and the former source of spare parts was in Philadelphia. And again, you see the problem with that. The blockade runners attempted to bring spare parts from England, but many North Carolina factories often ran at diminished capacity because of broken down machinery. Sometimes a general slowdown happened, as in April 1864, when some spare parts that had been imported the previous summer all began to wear out about the same time. Frequently, some of the water-powered mills were temporarily knocked out by floods. On one occasion, the shirt maker, J.W. Bostick, stopped production because all his workers came down with mumps, then diarrhea, and then measles, kind of in that order. And the aforementioned Yadkin Manufacturing Company burned to the ground in March of 1863. Perhaps without the blockade, things might have been a little bit different. Certainly, secessionists boasted about the potential for Confederate industry, but from the very beginning, even before First Manassas, we see that the same industry was hobbled by lack of access to supplies the South just did not have. Anyhow, here's how garment production worked. The garment producers employed professional pattern cutters who, using a pattern supplied by the quartermaster, cut out the pattern pieces. When I refer to the 4-piece body and the 1-piece each of the sleeves and the collar and the lining, those are the pattern pieces. The producers bundled up the pattern pieces with threads and buttons and distributed them to women who took them home and sewed them together. These women returned finished garments to producers and were paid for their work. Now, don't get me wrong. These are not the romantic sewing circles making uniforms for sons in the Army. This is an industrial process that took advantage of the desperation of hundreds, if not thousands, of poor women who had to work to earn extra cash. In fact, the producers and the quartermaster department knew they were operating a de facto welfare system, and some producers often pleaded with the quartermaster department for more contracts when women in their neighborhoods were particularly suffering from shortages. Sometimes, like Thomas Holt in Alamance County, prayed for more contracts so he can get these women off his back who were yelling at him for not having enough work. One of these women was Mary Moore in Salisbury, North Carolina, and she wrote to the governor about having participated in the Salisbury bread riot in 1863, and she described the work scene of her toddlers yelling and crying during the day, there's no food, and making 50 cents per pair of pants and 75% cents per jacket, and unable, sometimes kind of averaging about $1 a day's worth of work. And she compared that to the inflation that was, well, more than a dollar a day that could help with. So it's that desperation of women to find work that, for me, most closely parallels the modern apparel supply chain, because it today relies on the desperation of poor women as well. Garment workers in Bangladesh make from $75 to $95 a month, which is a vast increase from the approximately $35 a month they made before the 2013 Rana Plaza disaster exposed the poverty conditions that most Western brands, ranging from Walmart to Gucci, relied on in delivering inexpensive clothing to American consumers. Some forms of modern-day slavery, of course, still exist in the apparel supply chain, and this may take the form of child labor and harvesting cotton in Uzbekistan, or textile weaving in India, where adolescents are hired by labor recruiters, offering an education but not delivering on that promise. And some slavery may be in the form of debt peonage, which drives people into unpaid labor all through the supply chain, not just in apparel, but in many other supply chains across the globe. So transportation and distribution is the next point on our supply chain. Garment producers like H.H. Tate in Charlotte or Howard and Beard in Salisbury collected up finished garments, put them in boxes and barrels, and shipped them to Raleigh. And North Carolina has a pretty good transportation system with the North Carolina Railroad. That's the red line going from Charlotte through Raleigh and up to Virginia. But there are still places where wagon haulage is needed, particularly from Salem down to the railroad station at Lexington, or from Fayetteville up the Plank Road to High Point. And there were wagon hauling firms that handled that business, Clark out of Salem and Utley out of Fayetteville. And here's where we see the best evidence for enslaved people working in the quartermaster system during the war. This is a rental payment for a man named Abram, who was a wagon driver in Raleigh that the North Carolina quartermaster hired for a few months. And of course, Abram didn't get paid for his work, his enslaver did. And ironically, his enslaver is also named William Tucker, but that has no connection whatsoever to this William Tucker. And this is replicated throughout all parts of the system, from cotton harvesting to loading trains to cutting wood and sweeping floors in factories. And it's safe to say that this system couldn't have operated without enslaved labor as a part of it. Anyhow, boxes of uniform parts, about 100 per box, are shipped to Raleigh, where an assistant quartermaster for North Carolina inspected them and turned them over to William Pierce, the Confederate quartermaster stationed in Raleigh, who shipped them north to Virginia for distribution to North Carolina regiments. And this was kind of an accounting move so that the Confederate quartermaster could report to Confederate Congress how much it owed to North Carolina for the expense of making uniforms. And William Pierce's name is countersigned on this special requisition form for a company in the 35th for a requisition for uniform parts for a company in the 35th North Carolina. I wish I could tell you more about Major Pierce, because he was hilariously corrupt, but we unfortunately don't have time for his story. So the next part in the supply chain is use, actual kind of the end user of the commodity that's being moved along. So we have this notion of, well, we used to have this notion of ragged rebels that portray Confederate soldiers as experiencing the war in a state of constant deprivation, so much so that their uniforms were just falling right off of them. It not only fit the lost cause explanation of Confederate defeat owing to superior United States material capacity, it also fit the lost cause description of Confederate soldiers as noble sufferers. Their cause was more worthy because of the soldiers' willingness to endure their hardships. Modern historians have gone a long way toward debunking that general notion by exploring the tremendous efforts that the Confederate states made to clothe their soldiers. In fact, it is more likely true that in the last 2 years of the Civil War, Confederate soldiers were more consistently provided with uniforms and better quality uniforms than in the first 2 years of the war. And I don't have total numbers of uniforms produced by North Carolina, but it's likely in the hundreds of thousands of suits of clothes. A suit of clothes is a jacket and a pair of pants. At one point, the system was producing up to 3,000 suits of clothes a week. But the thing is that that's an impressive number, but it's never enough. And you read soldiers' letters and official reports, and the constant tone is one of need. And I do see the word ragged quite a lot. And so I fall in the middle of the ragged rebel versus well-supplied camps. The North Carolina and the Confederate quartermaster system did produce a remarkable number of uniforms, but again, it seemed to never be enough. And at certain points, the dire raggedness proved a real physical and emotional burden on North Carolina soldiers in the field. And so how do we explain this discrepancy? A whole lot of uniforms, but it's never enough. It's not, as the lost cause might have suggested, a matter of steady decline in Confederate material capacity, kind of predicting its eventual defeat. Rather, I think it's a matter of a novice system run by amateurs who overpromise the national ability, burdened by shortages and misfortunes. The result is this resulted in periodic moments of extreme deprivation that were the result of several things. One is bureaucratic confusion. North Carolina soldiers in late 1861 went poorly clothed because of a complex financial arrangement between the state quartermaster department and individual company commanders that it's difficult to explain, but it meant that the state withheld uniforms for a lot of its soldiers. Added to the shock of the wool famine and the slowdown in production because of that, and the failure of the quartermaster department to fully monopolize the output of mills in the state, even if the number of soldiers going into the field was rapidly increasing from about 20,000 to 80,000 North Carolinians just in 1861. The second thing is that active campaigns influence the deprivation, the uniform, deprivation of soldiers. In July of 1862, contractors in Charlotte couldn't get their jackets and pants on trains because they discovered that the Army had commandeered all rail transportation to move troops to Virginia for the planned invasion across the Potomac that ultimately ended in Sharpsburg. And those armies marching north reduced their baggage wagons and exceeded the reach of railroads. And when Lee recrossed the Potomac and sat on its south bank from September to November of 1862, his soldiers who had not been resupplied since early summer at the earliest were still out of reach of resupply and consequently were subject to the worst material conditions, I think, that they experienced over the course of the entire war. And in fact, the closest resupply many of the Army of Northern Virginia soldiers got after Sharpsburg was literally from dead United States soldiers on the battlefield at Fredericksburg in December of that year. At the same time, North Carolina regiments, not at the same time as Fredericksburg, but at the same time as the Army was heading to Sharpsburg, North Carolina regiments in Richmond had such abundant clothing that one private in the 57th North Carolina reported they simply threw away, quote, over 200 garments, unquote, on just one patrol down to Williamsburg and back. Places where the Army's not marching, in winter quarters, and later on when Robert E. Lee's kind of offensive capabilities prevented his army from exceeding its supply lines, meant that soldiers were better supplied and more readily supplied at certain points in their existence. So I don't really have any kind of modern comparison to use today as a point in the supply chain, but think about if you've ever suffered at the end of a supply chain, what would you think of our economy or even the state of our nation if we couldn't acquire the things that we needed? Maybe something like N95 masks for protection against a pandemic, and you suffered as a result. One thing on the Levi Strauss supply chain thing that doesn't appear as government policy, because that has a great impact on how these things worked. What I noticed when reading about COVID and the apparel supply chain is that the people who write about these things kept saying, yeah, COVID's having a real bad impact, but the apparel supply chain in the United States was under siege since September of last year, September 2019, because of federal government tariffs on Chinese apparel imports. And so that had between September and February this year had reduced apparel imports by 8%, which is a one-digit number, but a tremendous amount when in volume that you're thinking. And then compound the COVID problems on top of that. So we see government policy at work in the North Carolina system in two ways. In late 1862, in order to increase production of uniforms, the state demanded a near monopoly on mill output. At the same time, Governor Vance, Zebulon Vance here on the left, began to seek solutions to the problem of runaway inflation and attempted to put price controls on what millers charged for textiles in their sales to the state and on the open market. Millers protested, of course, but ultimately agreed to sell percentages of their output to the state for a fixed price below inflation wages, inflation rates, and with the remainder to be made available on the open market at no more than a 75% markup. The millers hated this. They felt like they would never be able to make any money and stay in business, but they didn't really have a choice because this was more than a negotiation. This was a coercion. North Carolina invoked the Confederate Conscription Act of 1862, October 1862, that permitted mill workers to be drafted into the Army. And state conscription officers enrolled mill workers in the Army and then assigned them to temporary duty in the mills, as if they had never actually left. But what that meant was that if the state caught rumor of mills selling beyond the 75% markup, or that they were selling more than their allotted amount on the open market, a conscription officer would suddenly appear and make noises about sending workers into the Army, thus effectively shutting down a private business. The state never actually did close a mill and conscript its workers, but this technique was a transparent threat and everyone knew it. And it worked. The state did increase its textile consumption for uniforms. The more pressing government policy lay in the larger Confederate vision for the quartermaster department as the war progressed. To explain that, I got to give you a little background on this. So the Confederate quartermaster department under Abraham Myers operated like this. Clothing bureaus and military departments were solely responsible for clothing the soldiers in those departments. And that makes sense from a pre-war U.S. Army perspective, and Myers was a pre-war U.S. Army quartermaster. But in the dynamic wartime conditions of the rapidly shrinking Confederate states meant that some departments starved while others had abundant supplies, although more starved than not. Alexander Lawton, a former field commander, took over the Confederate Quartermaster Department in August of 1863 and determined that it was a terribly inefficient system. Further, as U.S. armies liberated more and more territory, it reduced the production capacity of Southern industry. What Lawton saw in late 1863 then was that North Carolina, with its factories in the western part of the state, had the largest and most integral industrial capacity remaining in the Confederate States, and that capacity was devoted to only one part of one army. Lawton's plan then was to streamline the Confederate quartermaster's control over all Southern manufacturing and to use that control to direct clothing produced in any place in the Confederacy to whatever military force in the field required it at any moment. So he began a determined campaign in 1864 to force the North Carolina quartermaster to give up its operation and let North Carolina mills produce directly for the Confederate Quartermaster Department. First, in spring of that year, Lawton asked Vance to end state contracts with mills and let the Confederate quartermaster make new ones. That effort faltered because Lawton gave that duty of negotiating that situation to the previously mentioned inept and corrupt quartermaster William Pierce in Raleigh. Pierce bungled the negotiation badly, and the state adjutant general just said, "No, we're not doing this." Lawton then informed the North Carolina quartermaster's financial officer, Moses Bledsoe, that further payments to the state would be made in depreciated older currency. Now, don't know if that was an intentional threat, but I believe that the financial officers in North Carolina understood that to be a threat. Lawton renewed his entreaties with Vance over the summer, and Vance responded somewhat under pressure by releasing 10,000 uniforms for Lawton to deliver to general use in the Army of Northern Virginia. And around the same time, Vance released 10,000 uniforms for the Army of Tennessee in the Western Theater. Now, Lawton prevailed eventually because of two things. In an unexpected turn of events, the North Carolina State Treasurer, Jonathan Worth, stepped in. Worth had spent his years since late 1862 in office untangling a rather atrocious budgetary situation. Part of that was the fact that North Carolina's military budget was not under his supervision, and the Adjutant General did not inform him that it was running a deficit of up to $5 million. And Worth identified the quartermaster operation as the chief source of arrears in finances, no doubt because the Confederate Congress had been terribly behind in its own reimbursement payments to the state. In fact, the Confederate Congress didn't start making payments until the summer of 1863, and only when North Carolina attorneys went to Richmond and worked that payment out of them. And still, the government never paid as much as it owed to the state. In short, Worth figured out the quartermaster operation was a liability to the state and its relatively good credit rating. He induced the state legislature in early 1864 to take over the military budget from the governor and the adjutant general, and convinced the legislature that the Confederate quartermaster could handle clothing the troops better than the state could. On top of that, Lawton renewed his efforts in the late summer to send quartermaster agents into North Carolina, and this was a violation of the earlier agreement to keep quartermaster agents out of North Carolina, to strike better deals with North Carolina millers than they had with the North Carolina Quartermaster Department. Millers began to desert the North Carolina Quartermaster Department, make contracts with the Confederate Quartermaster Department. The state of North Carolina stopped protesting, and essentially by the end of 1864 gave up the effort. By early 1865, in the documentary The Quartermaster Papers in Raleigh, we see a whole lot of fussing over the production of shoes for the Home Guard, and not a whole lot of trying to get uniforms to soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia. So we have 4 years of difficult supply chain problems. And what does this say about the health of the Confederate nation? The shallow thing to say is that secessionists didn't think it through. No mature industrial base, no domestic agricultural production to support it, no taking into account concurrent wars in South America and Europe that might have informed how a modern supply chain for uniforms might have worked. And to be fair, they didn't think the United States would worry too hard about them leaving, and expected to continue getting supply, trading with the northern United States or the remaining United States for the supplies that it needed. But maybe that suggests some of the level of their arrogance about considering the United States' determination. Anyways, I said that was a shallow thing, but I might take that back because the other day I read James Fallows's assessment in the recent Atlantic Monthly about our current government's response to the COVID outbreak. And he wrote that epidemics in the past 2 decades, quote, the US government, quote, with its combination of scientific and military logistics might, would coordinate and support efforts by other countries. The fact that the US would take the primary role had been expected, but this time it did not come. So governments can fall down real hard and damage the supply chain. Imagine the health of the global supply chain today and the ripple effects that are going to impact societies and economies in devastating ways if the coronavirus had been confined to China. On another front, we see in the Confederate quartermaster consolidation after 1864, what we see is an example of what historian Michael Bonner has called the Confederacy's maturing corporatism. And that means that a powerful central government monopolizes and coerces private industries, and private industries go along with this in exchange for helping shape policy. And we see this at the Raleigh level, and we see this at the Richmond level in both cases. But more importantly, we see it developing in the Confederacy after 1863 as a response to the failures of the previous 2 years, or the first 2 years of the Civil War. Now, if you come see Southern Ambitions at the temporary, in the temporary gallery, which is right outside this door here, or listen to Adrian at his book talk coming up, you'll see that the Confederacy that seceded in 1861 was not the Confederacy that faced the world in 1864. It went from a secessionist movement that loved to talk about how it, with its cotton and its slavery, could make a positive contribution to the global order and be a natural part of it. But the global order didn't care. And the Confederate States spent the last 2 years of the war frantically warning against radicals and revolutionaries running rampage throughout the world, threatening the stability of stable nations like the Confederate States and England and France. Their inborn conservatism really came out when it was challenged during the war by circumstances. And we see that with the quartermaster system as well. The initial failures, some unavoidable, some not, eventually led to a transformation into a slightly authoritarian corporatist state. So what does this have to do with us today? This is my final thought here. COVID will change our supply chain, and it may change us. The only question is, in what ways? Will we sweep toward our more conservative tendencies like the Confederate States did? Or will the lessons of failing supply chains make us more conscientious about the systems of poverty and near slavery and tenuous connections that support our own lifestyles in the United States today? And of course, it's too soon to tell, but one thing is for sure, and that is that it is up to you. Okay, so thank you. Here's what I want to do. I can't see if there's any comments or questions so far, and Kelly will kick in on that. But before we get started on that, I need to do something that I hope you all hang around for and help me out with. I need to ask you a thing. You'll notice that I didn't tell a straight story about the North Carolina quartermaster system, and I didn't stick straight to the history of the subject matters, but I wove that in with observations about the modern apparel supply chain. There's a reason for that. But what I want to ask you is, how did you respond to that? What did you think of that, weaving in the historical and the modern and trying to find connections to that that might make the story slightly more relevant, or at least a platform for knowing more about the world we live in now? And the reason I'm asking is that we are planning an exhibit on this topic, and I'm thinking of ways for the visitor journey to move not just through the historical elements, but also through the lessons we can take away from being better consumers in our own lives. And so the outline that I walked through this evening is the outline that we're thinking about doing. Now, I want to see if this works before we commit to it in the exhibit. And so what I'd like to do is please mention something in the comments, send me an email. My email address is on the screen right now, or hang around for the post party after the Q&A. We'll unmute people who want to stay and give me some feedback itself on your own, and we can talk it out. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, go look at the comments, or at least Kelly could start hitting us with some questions.
Yes, and Chris, there were two questions that came, I think, just to me privately, so I'll start with those. The first is, did each CSA state set up a quartermaster department under the same conditions?
There's a lot of things about, I always start this out listening. There's a lot of things about this I don't know too much about. I studied and learned about the North Carolina system when I was living and working in North Carolina. And so I wasn't particularly paying attention to what South Carolina and Georgia was doing. I believe Georgia and South Carolina did do this to some extent, but maybe not as, certainly not as much as North Carolina did. North Carolina really ran with this. One of the things is that each state did have a quartermaster department because quartermasters did more than just provide uniforms to soldiers in the Army, but they were also responsible for paying soldiers. They were responsible for getting lumber and wood and feed for horses and riding supplies, stationery for the Army. And so there was a larger kind of view of what quartermasters did that was required in some degree on a state level in all the other states. So there were quartermaster departments in other state military establishments, but none did as much as what North Carolina did. And I think that also includes for northern states as well. If someone knows better, please throw it in the comments.
And then the other question that I think I only received is from Clark Scott, and he answers your question right off. Excellent job referencing supply lines today and comparing with 1860s. And then ask, was flax ever considered as a lighter fabric for uniforms in the warm seasons?
And so flax would be linen. And my answer to that is I am not entirely sure. I don't know what and the reason why I'm not sure is because it never comes up in the correspondence between the millers and the quartermaster departments. So my answer would probably be no. Now, was there a lot of clothing items that were made from linen on a civilian level and on a civilian level sent to the Army? Of course there was. But for some, I don't know enough about kind of the background on flax production or linen production to explain why that was not really used in the Army. Now, of course, the Confederacy had an abundance of cotton, and so maybe, you know, this question always comes up is why didn't they just make all cotton uniforms? And that is because cotton wears out. It wears out real fast, and they wouldn't be able to keep up with the demand for new uniforms if it was all cotton. Wool provides not only the durability to make these uniforms last, but also it provided some level of warmth and also waterproof for these soldiers that are out in the weather all the time. The quartermaster department did ask Henry Fries one time about what's the possibility of making all cotton uniforms, and he said, you know, no, that's not going to work. And I'll do the experiments if you like, but that stuff's not waterproof and it's going to wear out, and we do not recommend doing that.
And I think, Chris, you should be able to see the other questions that are down there in the chat feature.
All right. Thank you, Cindy, for the feedback. I mean that. Let's see. How did quartermaster issues in the Confederacy compare with quartermaster issues in the United States? This is another thing. I know what happened in North Carolina. I don't know what happened anywhere else in the world. It's certainly a similar system in which private industries, as far as I know, and this may be, you know, again, if someone knows better, toss it in the comments and let me know. There were private industries that were making uniform parts in the United States as well, but also the United States Quartermaster was also producing uniform parts. I think the Schuylkill Arsenal in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia was a big producer of uniform parts. One of the major differences between the Confederate system and the United States system is that the women who worked in the United States system were also subject to low wages, but they actually could do something about it in terms of forming labor associations, so kind of proto-unions, proto-labor unions that women seamstresses for for the Army in the United States formed and demanded better wages and probably received better wages, at least in some measure. And so to me, that's the more interesting thing. Also, United States Army uniforms were all wool flannel. So it's a thinner wool than a broadcloth, but ideally military uniforms would have been all wool altogether. So using cotton in Confederate ones was certainly stretching it out a bit, allowing it to stretch out a bit. Did Southern cotton growers get more money from the Confederate States or trying to sell to Europe through the blockade? Thanks, Rod. That was, that's actually a thing that comes up in Southern Ambitions, is that one of the, there's kind of a little bit of a economic and supply line backstory on this one. Since 1856, 57, and 58 saw a bumper crop in cotton production in the South that kind of, in a way, resulted in James Henry Hammond saying cotton is king. We can't be beat with our, we're making a lot of money off of cotton, but the world's buying up all our cotton as well. We're gonna do well with this. Kind of undergirded the secessionists' idea that we have what it takes to make a nation. We have an industrial base. We have an agricultural base that the world wants. The world's going to want us to be a part of this. And so what happened was that so much cotton got exported to Europe in the late 1850s. So what happens in 1861 when the South secedes and it needs England and France to pay attention to it? It tries to get their attention by not a boycott. What's the other word? An embargo. The Confederate States embargoes cotton exports to England and France, thinking that that's going to force England and France to take action on behalf of the Confederacy. And so what that means, in answer to your question, Rod, is that Southern cotton growers could actually not get their cotton to England and France. One of the reasons why, and so they weren't making any money off of it. One of the reasons why England and France didn't respond to this embargo was because of that surplus of cotton that had been built up in the late 1850s. They didn't need Southern cotton or Confederate cotton for a couple of years. Not until 1863, I think, did English and French mills start hurting for a cotton supply, at which point they started looking to India and Egypt for their source of cotton. So the Cotton King diplomacy was just a utter and complete disaster for the Confederate States. But one thing that we see that the Confederate States, North Carolina, one of them, is that they're using cotton for in England, is that the states are buying up cotton from producers, not simply for uniforms and tents and bags and whatnot, but to put in cotton bales, store in warehouses, and back up cotton bonds that they used in England and France to purchase supplies to run through the blockade. So the state of North Carolina actually built warehouses along the North Carolina Railroad simply just to store bales of cotton that they had hoped at the end of the war they'd be able to ship to England and France in payment for the bonds that they had floated in those countries. So I'm in and out of this chat thread. I don't know where I am on the questions. Kelly, are there any others that?
Let me see. I was saving the chat.
Okay.
So let me try to get back on screen and have a look. Did I lose you? There we go. Did Southern's Federal Mill on the Eno River make uniforms? Was hemp ever used for clothing?
I've never heard of hemp being used for clothing. If it was, once again, someone throw it in the chat. I've never heard of that. Never come across it in the quartermaster correspondence I'm looking at. One thing that small water-powered mills like those on the Eno River in central North Carolina and Durham and in Orange County near Durham Station, is that these are small mills that are cleaning wool and putting it into thread, making it into yarn, which they would then ship to the larger textile manufacturers in Salem and Charlotte. And so there's a number of mills on the River and in many other places in North Carolina that are making wool and cotton yarn that are being then shipped on. So that's one part of the whole supply chain that I didn't even get to, was these smaller mills that are supplying yarn, because you get the fleece off a sheep, you get the cotton out of a boll, and it's a bundle of fibers that has to be spun into yarn so that it can be looped onto the mill machinery and then woven into textiles. And so a lot of the smaller mills, like Southern's Federal Mill, like Orange Factory, further up in Orange County, and probably also McCabe's Mill on the River, were all engaged in that kind of production. Now, they were also using that cotton yarn to be used in bartering in the countryside, because, as I mentioned earlier, the people in South Georgia saw the Confederate cash wasn't worth anything by 1863, and so these poor women oftentimes were using cotton yarn as currency. And so these mills were making cotton yarn to be sold as currency. A lot of times these mills that are producing garments are paying these women in yarn as currency. And so there's lots of work for these smaller mills on the River and other rivers in North Carolina. And
Chris, did you address the question about butternut and homemade dye, and talk a little bit about fabric coloring?
Yeah, that's always a hot and contentious question in the matter of the color of Confederate uniforms. And I don't really have a great answer to that. There is a dye book, a handwritten dye book, that is in the archives at North Carolina State University, go Wolfpack, that does have a variety of different dye recipes that were using natural sources like walnut shells and sumac and other kind of roots and vegetables. And this is enough to, that stuff is enough to produce a gray colored dye at the point of dyeing the cloth. Quartermaster regulations required that these uniforms be of the color they called cadet gray. And I believe that these were, that it was actually came out that way, and these uniforms that were produced by the state, these tens if not hundreds of thousands of uniforms produced by the state, were gray. Because in the quartermaster records, whenever a garment maker tries to ship a non-gray uniform piece through, the inspector tossed it out, returned it, and would not pay for that. Now, what happens is that these natural dyes aren't color fast in the way that some indigo and some blue dyes and some other dyes are, and certainly not modern dyes. And so what we see is that these dyes oxidize. They respond to oxygen in the same way that iron responds to oxygen and becomes rusty. And so they begin to take on this hue. Now, what's interesting to me is that sometimes that's in the eye of the beholder. So I've spent a lot of time around good quality reproduction cloth used by reenactors, that and some that has been based on that dye book in the NC State archives. And I've had some of that stuff, and it's been exposed to the weather. And people look at that and say, why is that brown? And I say, that's not brown, that's gray. That's always been gray. Because I saw it when it was gray, and it was still gray to me. This thing behind me is gray, but someone else can look at it and see brown at the same time, or a butternut color. Now, that's not to say that other clothing bureaus and quartermaster inspectors weren't as stringent or were not more ready to accept into use uniforms that were not gray. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence and plenty of surviving uniform parts, plenty of period evidence that describes stuff as being, just straight up brown or yellow or what they called butternut in color in such a way that you can tell it was never gray. And there's also other surviving pieces that you can look at it as well and say, that's always been butternut. There's not you can look into the seams, you can't see anything that suggests that it has faded from a gray color at that point. So butternut did get through. Butternut clothing did get used, particularly I understand in the Western theater. But these ones produced by the state of North Carolina are gray, even though they may have oxidized and become brownish over time.
All right, Chris, one last question that came in, and I think we'll make this the last one. Is there any truth to the story that German POWs in World War I were issued stockpiled Confederate uniforms in North Carolina?
My answer is I don't know, but I doubt it. I've never really had an opportunity to kind of look into. So what we're talking about is that there were German prisoners of war captured off of submarines and from the Western Front in Europe during the Great War that were put in a prisoner of war camp in Western North Carolina in Hot Springs. And you can actually go to Hot Springs today and see where that camp was. There's a historic marker there for it. But there's always been the rumor that that the state of North Carolina had so many uniforms. Okay, there's a bigger story here. That the state of North Carolina had so many uniforms at the end of the war, they just put them in storage and kept them around. And just when there was prisoners of war that need uniforms, they were just like, fine, use these. I've never seen a photograph of prisoners. I've never seen any evidence whatsoever that they were actually issued these uniforms. But the bigger story is that kind of so the lost cause has a lot of angles and nuance to it. And so not only is there a larger lost cause that kind of emanates out of Virginia and Georgia that we understand, but there's a lost cause that comes out of North Carolina as well that has its own thing. And part of it is that it has to argue with Virginia all the time. It starts during the war, but it continues after the war. And so there's this back and forth between Virginia and North Carolina arguing over North Carolina's status in the Confederate States, because, Virginia would say, North Carolina had the highest desertion rate, and North Carolina would say, well, we had more men in the Army than Virginia did, and you'd never promoted our generals to higher command. And so Virginia got in the habit of kind of in the sense of they were aware of the North Carolina quartermaster operations, and they said that, well, North Carolina was stingy and withheld all its uniforms from the Confederate States. And so while everyone else was starving, North Carolinians were walking around with just the best, brightest new uniforms. And that wasn't true either. But the idea is that there's this rumor that North Carolina finished the war with so many uniforms on hand that they didn't even have a chance to issue them all to all of the soldiers in the field. And that was considered kind of a mark of, and kind of saying that North Carolina was being selfish during the war. It was hoarding. It was not helping out the other Confederate states. And so what I believe to be the case is that kind of the origins of this story come from rumors that at the end of the war in April 1865, soldiers leaving the Army of Northern Virginia and soldiers leaving the Army of Tennessee in North Carolina, and North Carolina civilians, in their desperation at the last month of the war, broke into warehouses and found uniform parts there, which they commandeered for their own use. And so that kind of grew into a larger story of there just being warehouses full of uniforms. What I think they actually found, and kind of this is kind of my theory, is that there was a supply chain going. These uniforms were, in a warehouse waiting to be inspected. They were in a warehouse waiting to be loaded onto a train. These things weren't going to stay in that warehouse. They were going to get shipped to the front, because no matter who was making them and no matter who was using them, they were in need, they were needed, and they were in motion. And there wasn't any kind of vast storehouse of North Carolina uniforms at the end of the Civil War that people broke into and revealed North Carolina's hoarding tendencies. That's not the case at all. So that's part of also the reason why I don't believe the story about the German prisoners of war wearing uniforms.
All right, well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for that excellent talk tonight. I am going to leave the meeting, and anyone that wants to is welcome to do that. But if you want to hang out and chat with Chris and kind of talk about his new exhibit and the ideas, feel free to do that. And Chris, I've made you host, so when I leave, you should still be able to talk to people.
Okay.
At least that's what we hope. So good night, everyone. Thank y'all for joining us.
I'm trying to copy the comments and it's not working, but we'll get it figured out.
What's not working?
Trying to copy the comments.
Oh, I have copied them, at least all the ones that came in up until now.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
All right. And I am at this point, I want to see, I'm going to unmute everyone.
Yeah, I'm going, but I don't know. I guess it's it.
I can hear all of you now. I can hear most of you now if you haven't unmuted yourself. There you go. Hi. I know many of you. Hi, Beth. Hi, Diana. Hi, Pete. Bernie. Hi, Ann. Hi, all the people I don't know. I hope that's Anna Edwards on Anna's iPad.
It is.
Hey, Anna.
Hey. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any follow-up questions? Any specialty questions? I'm surprised Neil's not here anymore, but thank God, because he would have asked me to.
Do what now?
There you are. Hey, Neil.
Hey, Chris. I mean, Dr. Graham. Very good job, sir.
Thanks. So yeah, did anyone want to just to add a bit? Did anyone want to make more comments about kind of this idea of having a bit between historical and contemporary situations?
I thought your blending of the modern and the historical parts reflected more interest in on our part on both sides. The modern one made us connect more to the historical records and the historical events and see them in a new light from our modern perspective, which is always difficult to do with dealing with events from so long ago. And then show the similarities between quartermaster issues now were exactly the same as the quartermaster issues then, just in a slightly different variation. So that was really interesting.
You're giving me the right answer, but if there's if there's someone who disagrees, others want someone in the chat who didn't really care for it. If you disagree, man, please, I'm happy to hear it. And I'm taking notes.
Watch my hand.
It's a question.
So if you want to send me an email on that, that's great. I'll put the let me see if I can help out some people here. Diana, I don't know how.
Oh, there we go.
Hey.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That was very good. I really enjoyed that. As far as the modern comparisons, it's something I've always been told you shouldn't do, but I didn't mind it. It was, I guess the risk is making the two seem too parallel, like, you know, very equivalent in every way, which you didn't do, but I really did feel like it held my interest, and I feel like it would for visitors who maybe are not as familiar with the subject matter as well.
Thank you. Yeah, as I kind of put the points together and kind of draw out the connections, yeah, there is definitely a risk of too much making connection too parallel between.
I threw it away.
I do recognize it.
But Chris, this is Anna. I think you did a good job of really simply laying out the idea that, you know, we deal in supply chain dynamics now, just like, you know, they did then. That was wartime. And there could be places around the world where at this moment, people are dealing with wartime supply chain dynamics, you know, so it's helpful, I think, to draw those historical comparisons, especially since we buy clothes. We continue to buy clothes.
Yeah. And certainly I hope that one thing that results from this exhibit is not only have a deeper kind of this unexpected story of the American Civil War and of the Confederate experience, but also maybe a little, maybe some of y'all know more about this than I do, but maybe a little more conscientious about the choices we make.
Yeah. I mean, during the early months of the COVID lockdown, you know, we sort of had this moment where we're not going to go out to the store, so we're going to order things online. But we were also hearing that every time you make an order that Amazon warehouse workers have to process, then we are actually asking them to engage in activities that could be detrimental to their health. And so could you please limit your orders to health-oriented or, you know, absolute items that are absolutely needed. So it was a way that also helped articulate our own direct engagement in the supply chain, right? We need wine and beer, apparently.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that some of our colleagues might be drinking a margarita right now. I'm having one definitely when I get home.
That's right.
Oh.
Cool.
I see Ann Hayes on here. Ann, can you hear me? Ann had a, I don't know if Ann can hear, but I know she had a question about a quartermaster that she's been researching. And he was a Confederate quartermaster. And Thomas Brown is notable for being the man who sold Robert E. Lee his horse travel. But Thomas Brown was a post quartermaster, and that's kind of a different kind of quartermaster than the ones we've been talking about tonight. Post quartermasters that are stationed in a certain region, they have a military presence, and they're responsible for all quartermaster operations areas, particularly finding supplies, whether it's fodder for horses or wool for and just lumber and hauling, and it's a very tedious job, usually occupied by someone who had been a dry goods market. So that's what Thomas Brown is post quartermaster.
Chris, the exhibit that you said you're working on for the museum, is that what you were saying it was for? Have you figured out your central organized question yet, or how you're going to address the, what are your ideas for the curation of your exhibit?
Yeah. I was going to figure out what picture to share. I'm doing that in conjunction with an independent miner. But
You're really breaking up. It's really hard to hear you.
okay. The other said I could open the door in the exam room.
Is everybody else able to hear him, or is it just me?
Oh no.
You what?
He's breaking up.
Okay. I didn't know it was just my audio.
No, he's bad.
I'll that I know that I understand that my audio is in and out, but I actually would like to, through exposure to this story about supply chains, motivate and kind of platform or scaffold our visitors' ability to make good choices about ethical supply chains today. And so going through this and seeing the connections to poverty and slavery, and there are ways that we can kind of connect that with you to think about, well, what can I do after I leave here in terms of the consumer choices. But anyway, but the parts that I'm working on with the independent designer right now involve these points, these story points along the supply chain. So raw materials, manufacture, product manufacture, workers, transportation and distribution, use in the Army. And so it follows the same general outline as what we talked through tonight.
What do you do? Hold up.
So what strikes me as particularly interesting about the show that you gave tonight, the detail and everything you gave was interesting and fascinating for sure, but was how the supply chains cross so many different facets of everyday life. The food, the clothing, the weaponry, the bullets. I mean, you didn't talk about those other things, but it made me start thinking larger about different types of supply chains and how those work, even for non-soldiers in that time period, and how they intersect and how they move apart and deviate from each other. Like it just, my brain was opening up like a map while you were talking, because I kept tracking, what about people in Ashcroft? What about people who weren't soldiers? What about people who had to sew their own clothing at home? What about people who sent uniforms to their own relatives out in the field? And it was just so, I was really interesting how it crossed so many, and even the railroads and the topography and geography of the locations and the rivers and the railroads. It was just really, really interesting to kind of think about all those facets.
Yeah, and what's hard to keep up with in the Confederate experience, how dynamic all that is, particularly as the United States Army's liberate territory, capture roads and railroads and rivers and ports, and just simply the territory that is producing the raw materials for everything across the board, everything from paper to uniforms to metal for armaments, that's constantly changing. And so. And so it's always a struggle for them. So I'm going to round this out and say thank you for joining me. And it's great seeing y'all, especially all my friends from North Carolina. So I am going to send me an email if you like, but I'm going to close this out. And I appreciate you hanging around and chatting for a few more minutes.